Okay, great. So first of all, thank you all for making and taking the time to come to this Weiße Haus or join us online for this artist lecture and conversation with Liliana Mead-Martin, who is here online with us. Before I introduce Liliana, I would like just to enter the event by introducing a bit the context in which it takes place and how it also emerged. First, I would also like to thank this Weiße Haus for their support in hosting this event, making it materially, physically, and virtually in a virtual and physical sense possible, and for promoting it. Here I would like to thank also Lea Mareike Zambale, Pia Wamsler, Elena Blum, and the Blockfrei Collective, the directing team of das Weiße Haus, consisting of Nevena Jankovic, Jana Dolecki, and Eva Kovac, the latter who also was our primary contact within the team. I would also like to thank Henrietta and Mareike who helped me setting up today. This event is part of the program of Immediate Matters, Speak We Must Speak, one of the program sections of this year's. Can everybody hear me? I'm just speaking on the microphone so that everybody online can hear us as well. Um, uh, this program is one of the program sections of this year's Klima Biennale. This year's Immediate Matters curated by Anne Faucheray, who is also here today with us, who gave the program its conceptual underpinnings under the title Speak We Must Speak, and invited this great group of 10 independent spaces to create shows and events in dialogue with her concepts. Acting as a counterbalance to the Biennale's overarching theme, Unspeakable Worlds, Anne's curatorial line invited and still invites us, both the artists and curators taking part in the program, to stay with the trouble of language in the face of the ongoing climate emergency. As she describes in her curatorial texts, in the projects presented, speaking is not a means to classify and master the world. Rather, it stands for regaining complexity, for engaging with what is troublesome and discomforting, for forging alliances, and for understanding ecology as a relational system. My name is Guilherme Magesi. I'm an artist, researcher, and cultural worker, active in the Viennese independent scene for the past 6-ish years. This event today emerged from a past exhibition project I curated with Rafał Mruszewicz and Marilyn Volkmann at the Independent Space Entre, where we're also curating this year. In the 7th District, and the exhibition through which we met was titled Emergency and featured artistic works centering on plants and plant life in relation to the currently popular issues in environmental ethics and vegetal ecologies, broadly pertaining to the reframing of the term climate change into climate emergency and climate crisis. This shift was a red thread through the exhibition's artworks and artistic practices, which demonstrated the artists' diverse forms of creating or imagining relationality with plants while reflecting on their agency in specifically situated contexts. It is in this context that Liliana and I met, and I first encountered her work, which resonated a lot with me due to its transdisciplinary approach and interest, an interest that, as I read it, and read, I think, much more also through our pairing conversations, is not only about using art as a channel for speaking about current themes, such as the ongoing climate crisis, but rather a motivation of making art about and for the current state of the world that we live in. With this, I would like you to join me in welcoming Liliana Mead-Martin. Liliana is a Canadian artist based in Vancouver. Her artistic practice explores the tensions at the intersection of material ecology, industrial resource extraction, and climate change, working with the remnants of changing landscapes, burned forests, eroded soils, crushed shells, extinct or adapted species. Martin navigates the friction between ecological collapse and the necessity of biophilic regeneration. Her sculptures function as physical sites of reflection, questioning how the permanence of life and future generations can be valued despite systemic instability and the climate crisis. From this perspective, her work develops centrally perceptible strategies for imagination, prevision, and resilience in changing environments. Today, Liliana will share with us a few of her artistic projects, amongst them Bio-Orchestra, a series of sculptural works, which a few you can see here, which we also still had from the show, as well as a few other initiatives she's involved in as a science environmental communicator, developing accessible narratives that address key environmental issues.
Morning.
including climate misinformation and deforestation. Through our talks in preparation for this, we saw how our interest in coming together today centers especially around the question of what constitutes an ecologically based art practice today, in a moment in which the differentiation between what is fiction and non-fiction feels more pressing than ever. We are also doing this talk also in a pre-celebratory manner. Liliana is also going to be the artist in residence at Museumsquartier as part of the Art and Ecology program at the end of the year. We have planned this event today so that Liliana will talk about her work for around 20 minutes, maybe a little bit more, I don't know. And we will enter a conversation into which you are more than invited to join. We will try to finish the event, I don't know, around like within 1 hour, 1.5. Let's see a little bit. For the ones, yeah, if someone wasn't paying attention, I'm using a microphone. This is just so that everyone both here and online can hear me. And I'm sure that during Liliana's presentation, a number of questions will emerge. So kindly ask you to either write your questions down. This is more for people joining online in the chat, or keep them in mind for once we transition into conversation mode. If you have also questions, I mean, I think we're also like quite an intimate group as well. So like if there are any questions about language or words, since we're talking about speech, and something gets lost in translation, these questions are also very welcome. I think we have enough languages in the room as well. And with this, I give it to you, Liliana.
Thank you, Guy, and very warm hello, and to both, especially the folks who have gathered at Das Weiss House. I just want to say a couple little thank yous, and then I'll start to share a bit about my practice. Yeah, I just wanted to say a very special thank you to Guy, who really brought this together, and the team at Das Weiss House. I really appreciate, even though we haven't met in person, I really am honored to be part of this programming around the Klima Biennale. And when I was reviewing the other artists and even project titles, the language was there. I was seeing it happening in the programming, and that was so inspiring and exciting. So I think I'll keep my little head here small while I go and just go with the images. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay.
Yes.
So as Guy mentioned, I'm a Canadian artist and environmental researcher based on the west coast of Canada. My practice is situated on the traditional territories, unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, known as Vancouver. And my work delves into themes around extinction, survival, and regeneration, often, however, through the lens of an evolving speculative eco-fiction. And through sculpture and various media, I'm trying to sit with existential questions surrounding climate change and how we find ways to connect those inquiries with an artistic practice and with an activation of some kind, whether that's activism or local involvement. So I'm constantly asking questions like, where do we grapple with our own capacity to adapt? How can we feel connected to biodiverse experiences? It's interesting in Guy's introduction, he mentioned in the curatorial text, regaining complexity. I thought that was a very good, succinct way of talking into this. And how do we acknowledge our deep somatic entanglements with Earth systems? So ultimately, I'm wondering how we embody, the values, ecological values that we want to see in the world, and then how do we educate ourselves towards consciousness raising and activating movements or participation. Parallel to my studio practice, I spent a lot of time thinking about the shared realities of creative labor as well. And so through a publication project called Biomass, where I work as editor and curator, I'm examining cycles of material and community exchange that sustain an artistic practice. And through Biomass, where I'm interviewing artists and translating or transcribing conversations and sharing exhibition uh, details of their work, I'm trying to surface uh, pathways that prioritize collective resilience over individual output. And this project started in 2020. I'll pop it up real quick here, where I was noticing a lot of the publication around artist interviews really focused on a sort of professional hierarchy, what shows they'd done, where they'd exhibited. And it was some of these publications were not feeling like they were serving an artistic community. And so I wanted to think about that with biomass as well as artistic burnout, which I think is a very interesting area of inquiry as it connects to ecological burnout. So this belief in collective action carries over also into my work with a collective called Hummingbird Collective. And this is largely a matriarchal structured collective that has some very, very knowledgeable ecological historians and younger science communicators involved. And our first major project that we developed is called Nature Creative Commons. And here I'm collaborating with ecologists, data scientists, and artists to bridge gaps between art, education, and environmental policy in my region of British Columbia. So we together work to dismantle things like misinformation, as Guy mentioned, and particularly regarding forest ecologies, which are under threat in British Columbia of deforestation, which is largely invisible to the majority of the population in Canada. And at the same time, if you spend time in these forests, it's very impacting, it's very affecting to spend time with these big trees, these mother trees. And a lot of people come to this activism this way by just experiencing an old growth forest or experiencing, a primary forest, which there are very, very, very few left. So together we aim to ensure that the communities that we collaborate with, and we have, collaborators, please check this out in your own time. But we're looking to create resources to help communities advocate for intact forests, and also to start considering forests and non-human life as essential kin to not just our survival, but to kind of collective well-being. So now I'm going to transition a little into a bit of a sort of mythological framework. So with that backdrop of a bit of an introduction to my practice, I'd like to walk you through some specific projects. And the first one I will focus on is a project called Deep Thirst Bioorchestra, which there are a few works there today. I think this little guy is there, and this little guy, and this one too. So when I talk about this work, I actually find it easier to talk about them as if they're real specimens. It helps me kind of collapse and develop a mythology alongside the work, which is really how the work came about. So it helps to when I'm speaking about this to kind of imagine the world that these specimens come from. So this work is currently that's in the space. I imagined traveling into the future and discovering a new species, one that displayed overt biomimicry of human forms, and also held traits of carnivorous pitcher plants as well as fungal networks. And these specimens also show phosphorescent adaptations, and their location, where I collected them, seemed to correspond to the levels of nutrients and moisture density of the surrounding ash and soil. So, growing from fragments of burned trees, all I found remaining were these petrified branches with these specimens on them, surviving due to some incredible ability to trap moisture and lure prey. And I'm still thinking about this work. In many ways, it doesn't feel like that one trip was enough. Would really love to return to uh, this location in future with perhaps a studio assistant, lab assistant, and make more collections and develop a better understanding of this world. But it helps me to uh, explore potential trajectories of what agency we might have now to impact change into the future. So through this lens of ecofiction, I'm allowed to synthesize both real climate anxiety and research that happens in my daily work and environmental collaborative work into a sort of artistic worlding. And I would be happy to talk more in depth about this, but I'm also going to mention one other project and talk a little bit more about biomass and Nature Creative Commons. So the next project I'll focus on here is work that was shown with Entree Vienna and about a year ago now. And it emerged from research into the Western red cedar originally. However, the cumulative impacts that, here, we'll do that, developed the questions around this work. They're applicable to many different types of tree species. It's just that right now, the Western red cedar, which is a very significant tree species in this region, as well as culturally relevant species in the region, it's going through some mysterious transformations. Some scientists claim that this is due to the extended drought that we've had in a northern temperate rainforest climate. And some people suggest that part of the reason that there's so much dieback with the Western red cedar is because it is losing its community of symbiotic species. And so I wanted to approach, questions around landscape and forests through the challenge of education and public, and thinking about the word primary and how that lays a foundation for understanding of ecological systems. So as you probably this kind of audience would understand because of the ecological interests, forests are a vital carbon store. They regulate climate, weather, temperature, moisture, and they provide housing for millions of species, including humans. But I'm noting specifically non-human species, insect populations, bird bird life, wildlife. And it's my understanding that forests are a critically undervalued resource and living system. So in the studio, I am working with ethically sourced red and yellow cedar, which is what you would see here in charred form or petrified form. And then I'm also working with botanical dyes and layering textiles to evoke the entanglements between the land and the environmental forces that shape it. This work in particular is titled Heat Agape, and that is focusing on the element of fire. So the primary colors in this work are reflecting a kind of simplicity, almost like a kindergarten level understanding of these systems. Forces like fire, sun, rain, temperature are being pushed to extremes due to industrial extraction and deforestation. But something that is less perhaps understood is the long history of fire suppression in this region due to colonization. So one of the projects that I've been doing research with collaborators, I'll touch on it again through Nature Creative Commons, is with the Natural Resources Defense Council, where we put together a wildfire primer for people trying to understand forest complexity. With this piece in particular, I was thinking more so about the feeling of being in close proximity to a wildfire, which I've experienced multiple times. Many people in this region have experienced multiple times. Wildfires have become the norm in Canada, and it's now to the point where people, refer to it as fire season. On that point, I'm actually doing a residency coming up in June in the El Dorado National Forest in Northern California in collaboration with Wildfire International. And it's a gathering of artists and scientists and writers to really think into this issue of wildfire while being together in a wildfire location. So I'm both excited and nervous about this. It's the first year that it's being put together, and it's being put together by two wonderful people, Liz Toohey Weiss and Anne-Marie Abbott, who run a publication called Fire Season. So it's in collaboration with them. And maybe I'll just move on a little bit to the different details of this work. So you'll notice with primary futures, the kind of heavy themes of blue, red, and yellow. So these are references to primary colors, primary forests, early education, but they're also a way of kind of stretching beyond perhaps a gallery format or artist speak format of talking about contemporary artwork and exploring ways where I can bring together symbolism and eco-education while staying true to my own practice. These details, for example, are called climbing nuts, and they're little sections that you can throw into a rock wall if you're scaling up, or they're a reference to climbing high into the canopy of old mother trees and discovering the tops of the trees going yellow, which for cedars in particular, they die from the top down. And this is actually a survival adaptation where if there's a long drought, as there has been in BC for the past 8+ years, we've had negative rainfall from what is typically stabilizing for the forest ecologies here. But because of deforestation, a lot of the rains that happen, that water is not being properly absorbed into the ground. And so you get the cumulative impacts of massive flooding, especially in rural areas that have a heavy forest industry. And although these correlations have been happening for years, in particular, I worked with a lab, conservation decisions lab, that had multiple PhD students looking at these issues of moisture retention and relationships between fire and rain. I think there's generally this big cloud that is used in the news covered by the words climate change. So often when we're talking about misinformation, sometimes it's just that people don't understand the specificity or the nuance or the ways that relationships support, develop. I get excited and then my words kind of tumble out. But the ways that these interdependencies, they have a very extensive chain reaction. And once that begins, the baseline of what is expected of these ecosystems changes. So we have a situation of shifting baselines, cumulative impacts, deforestation, increased heat, and of course, all of these things compact and then expand, especially with heat. Not to mention carbon and the fact that we completely rely on these ecosystems for not just clean air, but water purification, weather patterns, and so on. So this project was really a way to talk about primary forests as a fundamental life support system and the original architects that make our current sustainability possible. But as we've seen with the extractive model that is connected to a capitalistic model, this is a fantasy. This is a colonial fiction. And so that's where this interesting conversation around language, truth and fiction, I think art has a very interesting role to play in this, where perhaps the instinct might be to say, well, this is true, this is absolute truth, and this is false, this is absolutely false. But when you spend time in rural communities, or I've had the privilege of spending time with First Nations communities, there's actually a deep mythology that connects complex scientific data with a grounded social practice of ecological and social responsibility. And so these works were not so much intended to be descriptive, but felt. And I designed them to function as tools as well. These patterns are imprints of symbiotic species like salal and sword fern, which can grow underneath the highly acidic soil that occurs underneath cedar branches, because the needles that fall down create a soil that only certain plants can live in. And so I was thinking about this symbiosis and the charred remnants of cedar on a more esoteric, or sort of, again, sort of thinking into the mythology of the science that I was learning. So when these are dismantled, these pieces of fabric also function as cover, they function as blanket, they function as cloak, and they have rope elements and tools tucked into them. And so I often think about artworks as, are they a tool? Are they a being? Can they be projected on to kind of connect with in a eco-fictive way? Or are they tools for this journey, for example, journeying into the future? So last, I will also just quickly touch on these two other projects, biomass and Nature Creative Commons, just quickly, and then we'll just open up for conversation. So biomass, as I mentioned, is an online publication, and the term biomass is multifold. Biomass refers to measurement of organic matter in situ, in location. It has an ecological function and role. It's often added to through ecological detritus like fallen leaves or trees, um, decay. But it has also been appropriated as a term by the energy industry. Biomass is used as a term for burnable waste. And as part of this colonial fantasy fiction that is endless forestry activity, we've my collaborators and I have seen that even a devastated, a forest that has been devastated by wildfire, companies will still go in and harvest what's left, meaning they'll scrape the remaining biomass from the charred remnants of these landscapes and sell them. So, process it, call it biomass and sell it overseas. Um, there are many international companies that do this, but the more that people understand that biomass is not actually a green energy, the better, because as many of us know, greenwashing is rampant within the extraction industry model because they know that the majority of the public actually really care about having clean air, water, and soil to grow our food. So I think it's interesting that I thought it was a kind of sort of contentious term, and I wanted to bring that into a curatorial format to think with art alongside artists around the issues of burnout. And I was curious at the time how artists were dealing with, both on a studio level and a personal level, uh, burnout as over we've seen over the past several years, our responsibilities as artists keep expanding while the responsibilities of corporations seem to be uh, shaving off more and more of their commitments to public, to even their own board members, to uh, definitely, the needs of ecological stability or planetary stability. This is a project by an artist that I featured named Natalie Pershowitz, who basically collects garbage in her studio and just makes these absolutely ethereal installations out of kind of nothing. And I thought that was just such an interesting practice. Another artist who I'll mention, Shay Salehi, she develops questions around the relationship between technology and humans and our projection of technology onto non-human beings. She's quite talented artist, and also I like how she works with the sort of viscerality and flipping of the position of agency for non-human kin. And another artist that I'll just mention quickly is Emily Chudnovsky. Excuse the scroll here for 1 second. I want to bring up this one particular image, who, while Emily was living in the Yukon, I met her while doing a residency at the Klondike Institute for Arts and Culture. She was creating pulp flotational sculptures and installing them into these man-made ponds that were right across from historic gold mining activity, which have actually made space for forestry activity. So many of these industries actually pave way for the next industry to come in and extract, starting with clearing a forest and often ending with taking the minerals out of the ground, sometimes with a tree planting interlude. So spending time up north has been really educational for me to see the ways that these different landscapes have been impacted and communities impacted by colonization and extraction. And lastly, I'll just mention Nature Creative Commons because it's a project very close to my heart. So Nature Creative Commons was formed by this collective that I'm part of. And as a collective, we kind of function like a many-armed being that if some arms are busy, the other arms can pick up perhaps a little bit of the labor and community-based work that needs doing. And so we've kind of developed into a bit of a hub for research, resources, and we've also done some partnerships as well with the Natural Resources Defense Council, Conservation North, World Wildlife Foundation, multiple environmental organizations that need clear and scientifically accurate research that can be turned into visual information. So this is an example of data visualization that I developed in collaboration with Hannah Carpendale and Sasha Cron, where we were asked to try to describe how different landscapes have different relationships to fire. And so fire, I think, has been given this title of bad and scary, and the reality is historically fire has had a very important purpose and use within the landscape and occurred naturally without becoming what we now see as kind of these catastrophic, hundreds of kilometers wildfires that affect the global carbon, output of that year. So that is kind of the extreme that happens when you create monoplantations. I'm going to see if I have an example here. Complex versus simplified. Monoplantations is what happens post clear cut. All the forest complexity that developed over hundreds of years is erased and replanted, often with, in this region, it's often pine, which grows quickly and also burns quickly. So it's a species choice that both homogenizes the landscape and leaves the landscape much more vulnerable to rapid, quick-moving fire. It also simplifies the complexity that houses a living biodiverse ecosystem. So in my region, for example, we have, so many interesting variations on a forest ecology that changes from, the coastline to slightly on the interior, really wet, to almost desert-like, historically very dry. And so the trees grow very slowly. And with the change of weather patterns that we're seeing now, and I should mention the defunding of NOAA, which has allowed communities to prepare for either extreme weather, extreme heat, and therefore higher odds of fire. we're kind of being, I mean, the forest space is under critical threat right now. If you follow any of the, sorry, the American news, that current administration is trying to defund basically the national park system, which holds not just the only remaining, uh, intact ecologies, but also the only remaining housing for multiple endangered species. So some of my friends and collaborators are focused on species like caribou and the loss of caribou habitat, which is actually caribou habitat is naturally forested, but because caribou are often photographed in fields when they are not hidden, the assumption and therefore misinformation is that they don't need forests. Well, they're completely dependent on forests. Um, so I just wanted to share that and encourage anyone who's interested. This is a pretty amazing resource, um, and we're still developing this. To We have a Creative Commons licensing, so all the images that we put up on the website are free to use with credit for educational purposes. And really, our mandate is to educate and inform, and then back up every single piece of data that translates into the graphics, videos, media, or illustrations that we make by showing the hundreds of studies that have been done that prove what we're saying is true. We also cite my incredibly collaborator, Hannah, worked very hard to find the sources of this misinformation. And surprise, surprise, it's heavily funded by the forest industry and lobbying groups. So some of their favorite go-tos are, but trees need carbon, plants can't live without carbon. And it's like, yes, but we're past 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries. This is not no longer a solid argument, but there's also this public and long history of the earliest forms of environmental research being done by oil companies and extraction companies. And as soon as they got the data, they started heavily funding misinformation. Tracks back to the 70s. So with grassroots groups like the ones that I work with, sometimes it can feel very David and Goliath. But what's incredible is that once you actually start going into community, talking to real people and giving them like a comic strip or some zines, something that is accessible and tangible as opposed to a scientific study or report, the conversation can kind of connect to their children, the next generation that they have to be concerned about, and the well-being of their community. So those are kind of the heart connections we're trying to make while also covering our bases in terms of making all of our resources available. So I think that's a good introduction. I didn't want to go too in depth because I am very curious. I know that there are people in the room who also work in this art and ecology space or interested in that research. And I'm just as curious about the questions that you might have around this idea or developing language around contemporary eco art. But as far as my own practice goes, I felt the need to show more than just a couple of art projects, but the holistic picture of my creative practice and engagement with these issues, which really goes far beyond the studio. But within the studio, I'm connecting what I'm learning and kind of synthesizing it. And sometimes I have to go to these kind of places to imagine an alternative because it can be very disheartening to see what's happening in these ecosystems. Um, and that's a sustainability process for me. Making art is a sustainability process for me.
Mm. Um, First of all, thank you for the presentation. There are claps. I hope you see the
Oh,
claps.
yay. Good, thank you.
I would maybe first ask to the room if there are any like questions that immediately pop up for you, like after this very rich um presentation lecture. Yeah. If anyone, okay, then I will just start. Maybe maybe also to bring a little bit back to what let's say like the question that we posed to ourselves a little bit in preparation for this project, both maybe a practical question and also a question like about your practice, would be a little bit how do you navigate between these different hats, I think, of practices, of how do things come into the studio and out of the studio in the way, not necessarily only the works, but also the knowledge that you are generating or imagining. No, like I think that there is this, and a little bit how do you also, on the one hand, conceptually juggle it, but also on a practice, like when we were talking also about the biomass burnout situation of it, I think
Yeah.
uh, kind of to bring back to this question of what we were talking about, what constitutes like an ecologically based art practice, both in its concept but also in its practicality. I think it's a
Hmm.
just go away, and then we maybe then if anybody in the room also has a question or like something that they want to add, just let me know. I'm gonna be looking. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, well, here's one way to think about this. 10 years ago, my dream was to just be working on art full time. I couldn't really see beyond that because it was the only space where it felt possible to synthesize so many um, intersectional bits of research and interests. However, that has a limit. I think we're sort of at the point now. So, about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, right before the COVID-19 pandemic, I was having a lot of questions about contemporary art's ability to discuss ecology at the level that I wanted to have in terms of a conversation, dialogue, meaningful engagement or action. Um, I was feeling very cynical and perhaps a lot of eco-anxiety. It seemed that, going to parties and telling people like that, all these problems are happening and nobody cares. It wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't helping me, and it was certainly not helping my conversation partners. But I realized that the thing that was needed was more collaboration and more research exchange. And I think when you start stepping into, grassroots work or community work, um, it can be a, a process of understanding both first the history of what's already happened, because there's just this incredibly rich history of activism, especially in the region that I live in, around, especially in connection to the ecologies here. And I knew that I needed to start somewhere. So I started kind of on the volunteering level in, ecology spaces, grassroots spaces, thinking about regeneration, land back, native plant diversification and education. And I think that started the conversations in community that led to Nature Creative Commons. For biomass, it was kind of like this social question around who is a working artist who is talking about ecological subjects and doing that in a way that um, doesn't feel like it was centering themselves as the artist, but actually thinking more about an ongoing archive or an ongoing process. And so these conversations that I have with artists, I'm often asking the artist, when do you most experience burnout in your practice? And what I discovered, and I treated it kind of like a research project. I was like, where is this occurring consistently? And it's occurring at the administrative level consistently. And then where does burnout, how do we respond to it, care for ourselves? A lot of people were saying community, family, friendships. And these seem like very simplistic answers, yet why is it that we're never talking about that in the majority of artist publications? I kind of wondered about that as well. Um, and then over time, I've been developing a newsletter where I write essays and share um, audio versions of those essays. So essentially, kind of little podcast newsletter. And recently, I was thinking about burnout as a reflection of something that's happening on the biological level for humans because of what's happening to the ecological environment, to these earth systems, as a way to resituate that question to be broader than just me and my computer or just me and the workload that I have, and thinking maybe this burnout that I'm feeling is actually connected to a much bigger thing. And it's not so much that burnout is the enemy, it's that this is a collective experience that um, if we are feeling it all the time, no wonder our work culture is changing. No wonder people will no longer, accept the kinds of greenwashing kind of language that was once so prevalent, perhaps in the early 2000s. And so I actually think we are becoming sharper through um, being able to separate out what really perhaps is not so important. And I guess I try to bring that back into my own artistic practice because I have capacity of, I have probably a third of the year to really sink into my art practice and make hopefully a couple new bodies of work. But I also have a responsibility to my community. And especially if I'm speaking on these issues, that has to be grounded in real action. And so, in some ways, they are actually quite co-supportive. That said, I'm fascinated with burnout because I burn out all the time. I'm fascinated with burnout because I also have this embodied question of like of the anxiety that comes up with tuning into um, a, a localized and historied ecological discourse. It can feel quite overwhelming, and it can feel like you put a lot of work into raising awareness, getting the petitions out, talking to people, and then they just don't consult the community. Or sorry, policymakers will just not consult the community and go ahead and clear cut an old growth forest anyway. And so just because that is happening doesn't mean that there is not impact. Like very common in this discourse, the iceberg scenario. A lot of the labor is under the surface until there's a tipping point and there's a cultural shift. And I believe that cultural shift is happening now in the arts, especially, and with, an incredible project like the Klima Biennale, where these are topical issues now. So if they're topical, then we have to deepen, our understanding of what our responsibilities are in a given community. Um, does that make sense? I feel like I kind of talked around it a little bit, but um, yeah, it's both co-supportive and also, this question is like ongoing. I I think artists burn out because they care so much. And also, I think a lot of people are experiencing burnout because we are feeling disconnected from the systems that support our life force energy.
We have a question from the public.
Yay.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Eva. I think last time you exhibited, I was actually there and we met,
Oh,
but
wonderful.
I was happy to. I was actually looking forward to meet you again, but sadly you're not here.
Yes, I'm sorry that I'm not there, but I will be later in the year. I decided to, not to take away from your question, I just had this question of carbon, and I don't want to do more flights a year than is maybe necessary, but I'll be there November, December.
That's
Would
actually
love to have a
connected
chat.
to my question, this like personal responsibility when you're so aware of the impacts that we obviously as humans globally make. And I was wondering, in your artistic practice, you combine your like very different kinds of materials, like materially based, like the textile, which is natural, the pigment, then the wood, and then suddenly you have this neon like resin casts, which are amazingly working conceptually, but also aesthetically. But I was just wondering, what is your personal feeling towards using the resin, and what kind of resin are you actually using? Because me as an artist who works with these topics, I often find myself in this kind of tension between like, how do I communicate what I want to without really, putting my footprint so big out there, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that comes up a lot, especially with this series. Um, I think I've gone through different phases of this question. So I grapple with material. The material problem is is kind of we have perhaps too much access to contemporary materials, but for me, I consider it to be a question of scale and of perhaps commitment to the artwork as well. If I work with primarily a kind of uh, these works are a polyurethane resin which comes from a film depot. So in Vancouver, there's a big film industry where they do a lot of prosthetics and monster movies. This film series, The Last of Us, is being made in like 4 blocks from my house in a park, and they're using the alleys of Vancouver to situate a post-apocalyptic future, which I think is just kind of hilarious, but interesting. It connects because the industry itself, you know, the scale of what they use to create, say, our entertainment is massive. The scale of what I'm working with as an artist is really quite small by contrast. And and with questions around footprint and impact, these frameworks, speaking of language, they kind of need to be broken apart and um, and kind of reconfigured, re-questioned and interrogated a little bit. Because on the one hand, I do have peers and colleagues who work only with found natural materials, for example. Um, and then I have peers who are discussing ecology and they're using, databases and programs. So to me, I feel like the material question is always like a big pause before I purchase any kind of uh, material from this particular depot. But the 75% of my practice up until perhaps that sculptural choice is about relationships. It's about ethically sourcing the bases and the wood pieces. It includes, a daily practice of walking and biking as opposed to driving. And I don't, even though it would probably be good for my career, I don't really fly around a whole lot for exhibitions. I really focus on a local level, and I try to keep the impact of my works. The works in the space, for example, are very little specimens. I try to keep all those things in scale. And so I don't have necessarily a hard and fast rule about, toxic material versus non-toxic material. I actually use it in a way to connect with a history of that tension between, contemporary art processes and ecological frameworks or questioning. I'm not personally, I don't personally think I will ever have a pure, art practice. I don't think that I have the infrastructure for that. But I think if people want to pursue that, it opens up really great questions around the limits of how we kind of imagine into the material processes of how we're working. So, for example, like the organization The Material Way, which I believe is based in Norway, they have a whole program that's just based on bioplastics. And so my hope is to actually engage with this program at some point and learn more about bioplastics to just develop that as a way to get the same sort of forms without the polyurethane. But then there's this, the sort of carbon footprint idea is a concept, and we can't chop up carbon like that. The carbon cycle is exchange. And I think the things that need the most focus are actually these hugely scaled industries, not the artists. So when I see, conversations around, oh, well, this is an impure art practice or this is a pure art practice, I'm not sure that I, um, I'm not sure if I connect with that personally, because I think that becomes a little bit contextual and even potentially moralistic when I think we just need to be focusing on what's the scale of these larger impacts. And if I make, a work that is like using, half liter of resin to produce, 10 artworks or something, I feel like that's to scale with what I'm comfortable with. But I would never make a 4x6 block resin piece and call that contemporary eco art. I think that would be perhaps, as far as the spectrum, not entirely appropriate. So it's not a perfect answer, but it's kind of how I'm thinking about these things materially. I think it's a like question every single time.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's very Yeah, it's very important. So I'm very happy that I could attend. I also saw the exhibition last year, was lucky enough. I think the question of scale is super important. I don't know, but yeah, this is what the question of the scale, but also like the question of like to find ways also like not to reproduce this binary between like what is pure and what is impure, but also like in terms of ecology, like what is an intact ecological space. And I mean, this is also all this question of like protection versus sanctuarization. But this is my question. My question refers rather to like how do you choose where you exhibit, and do you try to like in the framework in which you show your work, also like, or maybe accompanying the exhibition of your work, do you ask the institutions or the spaces who host actually your works also like to act in an ecological way, or do you have a Schacht? How do you say that? A kind of like, it's not a rider, kind of like an ecological rider, you know, like you have, of course, like a lot of artists have like a hospitality rider, which makes sense, but like to host your work in that sense, also because you were saying like they are little guys, so you kind of like also like give them, personify them. Do you have that, or do you think like?
I wish that the, big, you know, big artists out there would engage on this level of policy and relationship exchange with institutions more so. Unfortunately, I think a lot of artists don't necessarily have that kind of um, we've been trained, in contemporary art to just feel this gratitude for even getting to share our work. That to put an expectation or a weight on an institution can feel scary professionally. Um, However, an example that comes to mind, well, let me think here for a second, because, I would love to engage with on that level of detail with institutions, but I've largely shown with small galleries, project spaces, and some commercial galleries. And so I've never worked in a kind of on a bigger institutional platform that had perhaps the sort of uh, infrastructure to engage with that conversation. And I already kind of know what the response would be. It requires curators who are at the level of understanding that these forms of agreement, of communication and engagement, say, you know, what we ask of an audience. I think this is where the curator kind of has to share that vision with the artist. And luckily, working with Guy and Rafal and Marilyn at Entree, it's an incredible project space. The conversations that we were having during install and after, and it all felt very grounded in the community. I feel like when it comes to bigger museums or galleries, I I would be curious to see how far they could be pushed into this conversation before it becomes a tension between collectors who might work within extractive industries, for example, or pushing up against the boundaries of what's considered professional, for an artist and how they engage with an exhibition. I'm really trying, I mean, part of the reason I work across these different platforms is I'm trying to diversify beyond considering my practice as a production. I don't want to be an art factory, and I'm never going to be an art factory. I would love to collaborate more. I would love to write more, and I'd love more, opportunities to teach or educate. But until the kind of bigger museum contexts are actually ready to have an honest conversation about their own systems of colonial infrastructure or extractive infrastructure or dependence on private resources or funding. That's a conversation I as an artist can't have, but I could potentially, spark spark the idea, hopefully. I mean, hopefully this will be something that's happening at large in, the next 5 years. We need it to. We need it to. One example that comes to mind, I worked at the Vancouver Art Gallery here in Vancouver for several years before pursuing a full-time art practice. I was an art handler. And the building is very old, and the entire permanent collection is in the basement in this big vault. But because of poor soil absorption and a lot of rain in this region, the basement is always flooding. And I find this to be sort of this hilarious, like, contradiction of the vault, the protected collection, and yet literally the water kind of rising at the door. All the art handlers would just groan on those extra rainy days because we would be like, oh, well, we probably have to sandbag out the $1 million artworks, protect the artworks. I mean, we can't kind of continue to function as if this is all normal. There's not going to be a normal future that we can plan on, really. And I don't say that to fearmonger at all. I'm just saying that because we really need to start getting a little more creative, thinking, outside of our typical frameworks of live, work, survive within this capital framework, and instead, how do we survive as a species? How do we survive as beings that require relationship with animals and elements? And I mean, this is what we're here to do, to be part of the world, not to become, cyborgian tools for the elites. I'm not buying it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. So my name is Liv. Sorry for my English, which is not really good and very Frenchy. Sorry.
No.
Yes. What you said about the burnout, I think it's very interesting. The burnout, like a response to what's happening at the moment, and I wondered if you've already heard of, or if you're working with, something which is called the work that reconnects from Joanna Macy. Have you already heard?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Because there's this practice about feeling his pain for the world, and it's a very powerful tool, psychological and collective tool she uses and she proposed, because she died last year, I think. So yes, what's...
Yeah, so that's a beautiful reference. Joanna Macy was part of a shared network that I am also part of through a couple different intersections. I didn't know her personally. I'm very familiar with her work and specifically writing, but she was making connections, as you mentioned, between, presence, being present, and linking practices like meditation with an ecological mandate, like sometimes conservation mandates, but also just generally considering the land as sentient. And this is actually not a new idea for me because I grew up in a unique community where, how do I say this shortly? I grew up as a Dharma brat, which is a North American context translated, which means that there was this movement of artists, poets, activists called the Dharma Bums that traveled around North America. And some of that faction of the Dharma Bums started to settle in meditation land centers. And my mother was a gardener at one of these land centers. My mom's a phenomenal organic gardener and horticulturalist. And my sister is an ecologist, an environmental scientist. And Joanna Macy traveled through these circles and kind of brought things from the space of meditation practice, Eastern philosophy, and kind of wove that through her professional engagement with ecological systems and the need to value them more. And where I thought that was very interesting is that she was really about walking your talk and living in accordance with your values. So if you're wanting to create a, peaceful community that is ecologically anchored, that also means that individuals needed to deal with their own minds, their own preconceptions, to be able to self-reflect. I don't know if she used the words metacognition, but really it was about bridging metacognition with global or ecological awareness. And so that was actually an idea that was percolating in this space since I was really little. And when she passed away, our collective had a meeting where we just talked about her and her work. I would really recommend her books and meditations. But I also think that this could be accessible to anyone at whatever level of engagement they're at. I think they're really good contemplations about how we really connect with the ground that we're on first, the place that we're living and the place that sustains us. And then there's a practice in Buddhism called Tonglen, which translates to giving and taking. And it's a breath-based practice where you actually take in pain and suffering. You feel into it, and then you breathe out, fresh air. And it's a process of actually dissolving some of our own psychological barriers around compassionate connection. So I actually think these practices pair beautifully together. But in the scientific realm, there has been this polarity created between any spiritual conversation and any scientific conversation. And actually, I'm going to a talk tonight by Suzanne Simard, who is an author and forest ecologist who wrote The Mother Tree. And she is often cited for her study on the World Wide Web. She's done a lot of research into the mycorrhizal connections between the roots of trees and shared nitrogen and carbon storage. And she's actually really developing some of this language too, I think, picking up in certain ways on where Joanna Macy was discussing, you know, presence with an ecology, but she also has a pretty rigorous research methodology as well, which I think is bringing some of the other scientists, warming them up to the idea of like of sentience in the land, which of course, on the other end, indigenous people have acknowledged this for millennia. So I think this is at a really rich space for, so you touched right into it.
I just want to really thank you for bringing this lecture to us, Guy and Anne, and thank you, Liana. I'm very much looking forward to meeting you when you're back in Vienna in November. So visit the Weisse House, and yeah, it would be a very good opportunity to continue the conversation. I don't want to shut this down. We're still open for questions. But I wanted to mention this. I'm really glad that I got to experience. It's very like you present like art practice as an ideal, well, not an ideal, but one of the possible bridges between this spiritual practices and scientific practices and education on the kind of third side as well. So thank you.
Thank you. That's so kind. And I am so excited to spend an extended bit of time in Vienna. And I'm so excited to work on, I'll be making new work in the art and ecology studio at Museums Quartier. And I don't have I haven't seen those studios yet. So I'm kind of curious, like, my hope is to make something more in scale so that it could be a little more immersive. And I have 2 months to make that happen. So I would love studio visits and conversations and coffees with people.
We will visit you.
Oh, good.
Would anybody else like to ask a question, share something?
If one last thing, if anyone is curious to kind of follow this research, my newsletter podcast is free. It's on Substack. It's called Liliana Flora Fauna, and I'm sort of posting more there and sharing more there than on socials, largely because I'm trying to slowly divest from any meta stuff. But of course, as an artist, that is very hard to do. So that is a place to follow my work and find ideas or connect with me. And I just wanted to say thank you for coming. I'm so pleased at the intimate group, and I'm so pleased at the lovely questions and engagement with these subjects. And I just really appreciate the care. And again, thank you, Guy, for magically bringing this all together as the community wizard that you are. I just can't thank you enough.
Thank you. And I mean, we will stay also in conversation for much more time, I think. Thank you. I applaud. Thank you. And we will talk then in a little bit over the phone, probably.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Have a great night.
Big crowd. Yes, have a great night. Yeah.